fellow homesteaders, gardeners, and cooks. My name is Jennifer. Welcome to Miles Away Farm. We are making a recipe that I almost completely forgot about. I usually make this every year during the summer, and I just hadn't thought about it. And then I was flipping through my recipes and saw it and was like, right, I need to make that. This is a baked brown rice dish that has zucchini and bell peppers, and I think the original recipe called for turkey sausage, but honestly you could use whatever you wanted. I'm going to use some linguiça that we made, but you could also use just Italian sausage. Honestly, you could make it with tofu. You could leave the meat out and make it vegetarian. So lots of different routes to go there. And then it has quite a bit of cheese in it. So it's just a really good, there's something about zucchini and cheese and rice together that I really like. And it's a great way to use it. Summer squash, we're getting down to the end of the summer squash season. We are in late September at this point. And I have some younger plants that I started from seed 3 or 4 weeks ago, kind of just crossing my fingers. I've lost a lot of my zucchini plants to squash bugs this year. I started out with 9 plants, and I think I'm down to 3, maybe 4. And they're looking a little worse for wear. And so I planted some new ones from seed, just thinking, we'll roll the dice. We might get a late enough season before we get a frost that we'll get a few off of it. And I put them in a different spot in the garden, so hopefully the squash bugs won't find it. But even if that's not the case, we've had a really good run with squash this year, with summer squash. And I've had a lot of fun cooking a lot of different recipes. But as is typical for me, a couple of them got away from me. They go from, when it's hot, they go from too small to too big in less than 24 hours. And so these are a little bit oversized. And because of that, I'm just going to scrape out the inside of them, which is kind of spongy and soft and a little bit seedy, just so that we have some firm squash to work with. And this calls for, I think it's 4 cups, calls for about a pound. I'm probably going to go over that a little bit just because I'm trying to use some of these up, and that's fine. More vegetables has never hurt anybody. And these yellow squash, if you have not seen them before, this is a patty pan squash. So it's a summer squash, but just a different shape. And I often prefer patty pan. I really like it. I think they have a little firmer consistency. They're a little bit less watery. And I'm going to roast these, so I'm just going to kind of chunk them up. I know they're going to shrink a little bit with the roasting. And what I'm really looking for here is what size do I want on my fork. So kind of bite-sized pieces, but not so small that they're just going to shrivel up to nothing if they're in the oven for a little bit. This is extra from this morning. I was making my 4th or 5th batch of zucchini bread, and I needed a little bit, but not quite a whole squash. This time I made zucchini bread with blueberries in it, and that was a nice treat. We've got some late crop blueberries coming in. And I'll probably just freeze most of them, but since I was making zucchini bread, I thought it would be a fun thing to add. And it was. And this original recipe calls for baking everything together, including the raw rice. I never have luck with recipes that start with raw rice and then want you to bake it with everything else in a pan. I inevitably either end up with rice that's soggy or rice that's undercooked. And so I basically just don't do that because it never works for me. So I'm pre-cooking the rice, and then I'm just gonna mix everything together and then bake it. And I've done it that way for years. It works really well with this recipe. Yeah, I don't know what it is. I know, rice is all about the ratio of water, but it's also about evaporation. And I can never quite get that evaporation part right, where it's just the right amount. Too many disappointing dishes. So this is a mix. These are all sweet peppers, but this is a mix of bell pepper, Carmen, which is a sweet pepper that's called a bullhorn style, where they are long and skinny. And I've mentioned this before, but I really love them because they don't tend to get as much sunburn as the bell peppers do, just because they don't have those big wide shoulders for the sun to hit, and that's often where you end up with sunburn on a bell. And they are incredibly sweet. If I were only going to grow one sweet pepper, Carmen would be my sweet pepper of choice. They are, however, a hybrid, and so that is a drawback, is that you can't save seed from it. And then this one is a pimento pepper. I forget where I got the seeds from this. But usually the only place you ever see pimento is stuffed into olives. And it's a fun one to grow. It's just a nice sweet pepper. We are still dealing with what I call the tyranny of produce this time of year, where you just have so much coming in at once. And you're desperately trying to use things that you've spent, literally planning since December or January, and then growing often from seed in March. And now here it is August, September, and there's so much. And you don't want to waste it because you've got all of that time. But at the same time, there's only so much you can eat. And so I'm busy stuffing food into freezers and food into jars. I made a very small batch of tomatillo salsa this morning. This is a cipollini onion that had a weird growth spurt and blew out the bottom. And so I call these my scratch and dent onions. And they are fine, but they're fiddly. And unfortunately, they also hold a lot of dirt because of the way that bottom goes. And so they take a little work to clean up, but I hate to waste them. And they're a really lovely sweet onion, so let's see what we can do with this bad boy. Glug of olive oil, about a teaspoon of kosher salt. If you were using regular salt, I would do about half of that, so half a teaspoon. On a half sheet pan. I really should probably put this on 2 pans so that I'd get a better roast, but I'm just not that worried about it tonight. So there's gonna be some steaming because it's pretty close together, but we'll give it a good hard roast and do what we can. All right, got my oven preheated to 425. I'm going to turn my convection on so that it dries out extra. And we will come back in, we'll check on it in 15 minutes and give it a stir and then probably roast it for another 15 at least. All right, it's been 15 minutes. Let's give this a stir. I'm not expecting it to be anywhere near done yet. sure that is going to need at least another 15 minutes. It's been another 15. Let's take a look. Yeah, they're starting to look pretty good. I think I'm going to give that another 5 minutes. All right, our timer has gone off. I think we're about done with the roasting. I'm going to turn this down to 350 because we're going to be baking it later. Yeah, that looks a little better. I wanted to get a little bit of color on those, because once it's mixed together, it's unlikely to get any browner than it is now. So I need 1.5 cups of milk and 3 tablespoons of flour, and I happen to be out of regular liquid milk right now, and I'm remembering this great trick for making rich sauces without adding a lot of fat, which is I'm just using evaporated milk. And this is a 12-ounce can of evaporated milk, which is 1.5 cups, so perfect. This I need to add 3 tablespoons of all-purpose flour. And I may close to out of this too. It's time to go to the grocery store. Close enough. So what we're doing is making a cheese sauce for this. I'm going to whisk in this flour before this gets warm. That's going to thicken up, and then we're going to add some cheese. The recipe calls for Monterey Jack. You can use whatever you got on hand. Because we're making a cheese sauce, it is helpful if it's something that will melt easily. So I wouldn't necessarily use a feta or a Parmesan. Although honestly, you could just make this as a white sauce with milk and flour and then stir that in, shred it. It wouldn't be that big of a deal if it wasn't made into a cheese sauce first. Heat that on low, keep an eye on it, and then we'll add our cheese. So the original recipe called for 2 cups of Monterey Jack, which is about 8 ounces. And I'm going to use half of that as cheddar. I don't have any Monterey Jack in the house. And then I'm going to use the other half with some mozzarella balls that I have that I bought that need to be used up. And I think that'll make a really nice creamy gooey bit in there. So I'm going to do half of it with this. I'll make a cheese sauce out of this part. And then the mozzarella I'm just going to chop and throw into the mix when I mix it together. Half of the reason I'm using the mozzarella is because I really don't want to hand grate 2 cups of cheese. I kind of hate grating cheese. I've mostly been ignoring this, but now I'm going to actually pay attention. Turn the heat up and get this to thicken. And if you had a gluten allergy or issue, you could just as easily thicken this with cornstarch or tapioca starch or arrowroot starch. Any of those would work. It doesn't have to be flour. I can feel this thickening from the bottom up where the heat is, so you do want to stir it pretty regularly or you're going to end up with scorched milk on the bottom where that flour is settling. All right, we're getting close here. We've got a boil. It's nicely thickened up. I'm going to kill that heat. And now we're going to stir in our shredded cheese by the handful. You don't want to throw everything in at once, or you're going to end up with a big clump. By the way, this is basically how you make mac and cheese. So if you've never made mac and cheese, it's very easy. It's just a cream sauce that cheese gets added to, which turns it into a cheese sauce. And then you just stir it into already cooked noodles. Super simple. You can see how that cheese is just completely disappearing in there, and that's what we want. All right, there's the last of it. Again, this is half of what it actually called for, but I'm gonna do the rest loose in the mix. All right, so we've got our cheese sauce, and now we're just gonna assemble this mess. And I hope this bowl is big enough. So this is our rice. This was 1.5 cups of brown rice, 3 cups water. We've got our roasted veg. And you could do this with any veg that calls for summer squash and peppers. I think it would also be great with eggplant, roasted eggplant. But yeah, whatever you got on hand would work in this. I really love the combination of zucchini, rice, and cheese, and so I would suggest not leaving that part out. This is a cup of corn. And this is actually frozen corn from last year's garden. Here's our other 4 ounces. This is just a marinated mozzarella from the store that's gonna get stirred in there. And then, as I said, it calls for turkey sausage. This is linguiça, which is a smoked Portuguese, I think, sausage. And we actually made this earlier this year from a bunch of pork that we had on hand, and it's basically pre-cooked because it's been smoked, and so I'm not gonna fry it off. I'm just gonna stir it in. It's got a lot of garlic in it, so it's gonna add a lovely garlic flavor to this whole thing. This is a greased 9x13 pan, and I am just, for the sake of sanity, I'm really just gonna get in here with my fingers. You could use a spoon. It would be better if I had a bigger bowl, and so I think it's actually gonna be easier to mix this with my clean hands. Because this bowl is just barely big enough. And you can kind of, if you've got chunks of onion, you can kind of break those up as you're stirring. And I let that rice sit for a little bit, so I'm trying to make sure I don't have any big clumps of rice. And this calls for the original recipe, which I'm really just riffing on. I'm not following it really closely. For the cheese sauce to be mixed in, I think I'm just gonna pour it over the top. My stomach is rumbling, you guys. So you could really play around with the spices in this as well and do a lot of different things. You could go kind of a French direction and do like herbes de Provence. You could go a Mexican direction and use a pepper jack cheese and some chili powder. So lots of different ways to go here. I'm keeping this really simple, but you could definitely play with spices on this and do all kinds of things. Let's see if we got any serious holes here before we distribute the last of that. And hopefully this will sink. I'm going to make some inroads here. So this will just kind of sink down into that as it cooks. And if it doesn't, it's still going to be good. So I'm kind of mixing it in a little bit, just in the dish. When I cooked this rice, the original recipe called for chicken stock, and I really should have just used chicken stock when I cooked the rice, and I didn't even think about it. So chicken stock would be good in this as well, but not a big deal one way or the other. And lastly, this calls for 4 ounces of a light cream cheese, just dotted on top here. And I'm not going to measure this, I'm just going to wing it. This was a 8-ounce block that my husband bought instead of getting a container, because that's what happens when you send your husband to the store and he's not used to doing the shopping. So it's in this snap lid because I didn't want to work with it in a block, because that's a pain in the butt. And they always dry out and get moldy. So this is going to kind of melt down into this a little bit as well, and just make for some really delicious bites. Brilliant. It also calls for pickled jalapenos. I do have some of those. I think I'm going to put it on when I serve it rather than now. A little higher, 375. So everything in there basically is cooked. So at this point, all you're trying to do is heat it up. This calls for 10 minutes. We'll see how it looks in 10 minutes. I'm not sure if that's going to be long enough. It's been a total of 25 minutes. I think we're done. She's not necessarily a looker, but she's going to taste incredible. Got a little bit of browning on the top. Beautiful. Gonna be lovely. We're gonna let this cool for 5 or 10 minutes and then dish it up. Let's dish up this bad boy. Oh yeah. Oh, there's some cheesy goodness. Oh, stuff going everywhere. And then to make it even better, I'm going to top it with a few of my cowboy candies. It just calls for pickled jalapenos, not sweet pickled jalapenos. However, this is my last jar from last year, and I just made new ones this year. So why not? And I think that little sweetness is going to add a nice pop. So there you go. Roasted summer squash sheet tray veg bake with brown rice and cheese. Lovely, relatively healthy. Great way to use up extra garden produce, and it makes a lot, so you're going to have lunches for days.